I never thought the sound of my own son's laughter could break my heart. But there I was, standing in my tiny kitchen at 68 years old, holding my phone with trembling hands, listening to Daniel laugh about spending my life savings like it was pocket change. "Love, just use Mom's card. She's got over $100,000 on it." His voice was so casual, so dismissive, like he was talking about borrowing a cup of sugar instead of the money I'd saved from 43 years of working double shifts as a nurse. 43 years of aching feet, missed holidays, and choosing between buying groceries or a new uniform because mine was wearing thin. I raised Daniel alone after his father walked out when he was 3. I remember those nights when I'd come home from a 16-hour shift, exhausted to my bones, and still find the energy to help him with his homework. I'd sit at our small kitchen table, the same one I'm sitting at now, and watch him struggle with math problems while I fought to keep my eyes open. But I never complained. I never let him see how tired I was, how scared I was that I might not be enough for him. When he graduated law school, I cried tears of joy. All those years of sacrifice, all those times I said no to myself so I could say yes to him. It had all been worth it. My boy was going to have the life I never could. He was going to be successful, respected, secure. I was so proud I could barely contain it. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment with which city you're watching from. But pride can be a dangerous thing. It makes you blind to what's right in front of you. I was so focused on celebrating Daniel's success that I didn't notice when he started looking at me differently, when his visits became shorter, more impatient, when he started checking his watch while I talked about my day, like my words were taking up precious time he could be spending on more important things. The first sign should have been when he brought Amanda home. She was beautiful, sophisticated, everything I'd never been, designer clothes, perfect makeup, the kind of confidence that comes from never having to choose between paying rent or buying medicine. When Daniel introduced us, she barely looked at me. Just a quick glance, a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, and then she turned her attention back to him like I'd disappeared. "Mom makes the best apple pie," Daniel said that first dinner, and I felt a flutter of hope. Maybe this elegant woman would appreciate the simple things I could offer. The warmth of a home-cooked meal, the love that had kept our little family together for so many years. Amanda smiled that same empty smile. "Oh, how sweet. I don't really eat dessert, though. I have to watch my figure." She patted Daniel's arm. "We both do, don't we, honey? It's important to maintain standards." The way she said standards made my homemade pie feel like an embarrassment, like evidence of how unsophisticated I was compared to the world they were entering together. I watched Daniel nod in agreement, saw him looking at my simple kitchen with what might have been shame, and something cold settled in my chest. But I told myself I was being oversensitive. Young couples needed time to bond, to build their own traditions. It was natural for them to want independence, to create distance from the older generation. I'd done the same with my own mother, hadn't I? Maybe not quite like this, but still, independence was healthy. I convinced myself that once they settled into marriage, once the novelty wore off, Daniel would remember the woman who'd raised him. He'd bring Amanda around more often, and she'd see that beneath my simple exterior was a heart full of love for her husband. We'd become friends, maybe even close. I'd be the mother-in-law who was welcomed, appreciated, included. How foolish I was. How desperately, pathetically hopeful. The wedding was small, intimate, which I later learned meant Amanda's family and a few of their law school friends. I wasn't involved in the planning. Daniel called me 2 weeks before to tell me the date and location, like I was a distant relative being invited out of obligation, rather than the mother who'd given up everything to make his success possible. I wore my best dress, the navy blue one I'd bought for his law school graduation. It felt appropriate. After all, both occasions were about celebrating Daniel's achievements. I sat in the back, watching my son marry this woman who'd never asked me a single question about his childhood, who'd never thanked me for raising the man she was choosing to spend her life with. During the reception, I tried to approach Amanda's mother, thinking perhaps we could bond over our children's happiness. She looked me up and down with barely concealed disdain, took in my department store dress and modest jewelry, and turned away without a word. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, holding my small glass of champagne, watching the celebration of my son's new life and understanding with crushing clarity that there was no place for me in it. That night, alone in my apartment, I looked at the framed photo on my nightstand. Daniel at 5 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, his arms wrapped around my neck like I was the most important person in his world. I touched the glass gently, remembering how he used to call me his best friend, how he'd crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and whisper that as long as we were together, he wasn't scared of anything. When had I stopped being his safe harbor and become his embarrassment? The answer to that question would come soon enough, delivered through a phone call that would shatter what remained of my faith in the child I'd loved more than my own life. The phone calls became shorter after the wedding. Where Daniel used to call every Sunday evening to check on me, now weeks would pass in silence. When I'd finally call him, Amanda would often answer with that same polite coldness I'd grown to recognize. "Oh, hi, Eva. Daniel's in the shower. Can I have him call you back?" But he never did. Not that night, not the next day, sometimes not for another week. I started keeping track in a little notebook. Pathetic, I know. But I needed to convince myself I wasn't imagining the growing distance. March 15th. Called. Amanda answered. Said he was busy with a case. March 22nd. Left voicemail. No return call. March 29th. Called again. Daniel answered but seemed rushed. Said they were heading out to dinner with Amanda's parents. Amanda's parents. I'd met them exactly once, at the wedding, where they'd treated me like service staff who'd wandered into the wrong room. But Daniel spoke about them with the kind of reverence he used to save for me. "Richard thinks I should consider corporate law," he'd say. Or Margaret suggested we look at houses in Westfield, where Amanda grew up. I wanted to ask, what about the neighborhood where you grew up, Daniel? What about the little house where I read you bedtime stories and taught you to ride a bike in the driveway? But I already knew the answer. That life was something to be upgraded from, not remembered fondly. The first time I offered to help with their new apartment, Daniel's response cut deeper than any insult could have. "Thanks, Mom. But Amanda's got it handled. She has really specific taste, Everything has to match." The unspoken message was clear. My help wasn't sophisticated enough for their new life. I'd furnished our entire home over the years with careful thrift store finds and garage sale treasures. Each piece had a story. The rocking chair where I'd nursed Daniel through fevers, the coffee table I'd refinished myself during his senior year of high school. But Amanda's taste apparently required everything to be new, expensive, coordinated. A life with no history, no sentimental attachments to complicate the perfect aesthetic. When they moved into their new place, a sleek downtown condo that cost more per month than I'd ever made in 6 months, I wasn't invited to the housewarming party. I found out about it on social media, scrolling through photos of laughing guests holding wine glasses, admiring the pristine white furniture and abstract art. There was Daniel in every photo, arm around Amanda, beaming with pride at what they'd built together. But it wasn't what they'd built. It was what her family's money had bought. Her father had co-signed the lease. Her mother had helped with decorating. Her trust fund had covered the deposits. Daniel was living a life funded by people who'd never had to choose between heating and groceries, never had to explain to a child why Christmas might be smaller this year. I stared at those photos for hours, zooming in on Daniel's face, searching for some trace of the boy who used to thank me for everything, who'd once made me a Mother's Day card that said, "You're the best mom in the universe, and I'm lucky you picked me." When had gratitude turned into embarrassment? When had my sacrifices become something he wanted to forget rather than honor? The final straw came during Easter dinner at Amanda's parents' house. Daniel had called to invite me, or rather, Amanda had called, her voice carrying that forced politeness that made every word sound like an obligation. "We'd love to have you join us for Easter," she said, though nothing in her tone suggested love or genuine invitation. "It's at my parents' house at 2 o'clock. It's pretty casual, but you know how these things are." I didn't know how these things were, but I could guess. I spent an hour choosing my outfit, settling on a simple black dress with a pearl necklace Daniel had given me for my 60th birthday. I bought a small bouquet of flowers and a bottle of wine I couldn't really afford, wanting to contribute something to the gathering that had graciously included me. The house was magnificent, sprawling, perfectly landscaped. The kind of place that appeared in magazines about gracious living. I rang the doorbell, clutching my modest gifts, and waited. Through the tall windows, I could see people moving around inside, hear the murmur of conversation and laughter. Amanda answered the door wearing a flowing dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her smile was perfectly applied, like her makeup, and just as artificial. "Ava, you made it. Come in. Come in." She led me through rooms that looked like showpieces, everything coordinated and expensive and cold. The Easter table was set with china that caught the light, crystal glasses that chimed softly when touched, silver that gleamed like jewelry. I felt my simple flowers wilt in my hands, my bargain wine suddenly seeming pathetic next to the elaborate spread. Daniel was holding court near the fireplace, telling a story about his latest case to a circle of Amanda's relatives. They hung on every word, these people who'd never had to struggle for anything, who treated his modest success like it was earth-shattering achievement. When he saw me, his face flickered with something. Not quite embarrassment, but close. "Mom, you made it." He came over and gave me a quick, perfunctory hug, the kind you give distant relatives at obligatory gatherings. "You remember everyone, right?" But I didn't remember everyone because I'd never met most of them. Amanda's extended family, college friends who'd become successful in finance and real estate, people whose conversations revolved around vacation homes and private schools and stock portfolios. I smiled and nodded and tried to find ways to contribute to discussions about wine regions I'd never visited and restaurants I'd never afford. During dinner, I found myself seated at the far end of the table, between Amanda's elderly uncle, who was hard of hearing, and a cousin who spent the entire meal texting. The conversation flowed around me like I was a rock in a stream, present but irrelevant, something to navigate around rather than engage with. I listened to Daniel discuss his career plans with Amanda's father, watched him nod enthusiastically when Richard suggested connections and opportunities. "You know, son, it's all about who you know in this business," Richard said, and Daniel agreed completely, as if the woman who'd worked 3 jobs to pay for his education was invisible. When dessert was served, an elaborate cake from some fancy bakery, Amanda's mother made a speech about family and tradition and being grateful for blessings. She talked about the importance of surrounding yourself with people who shared your values, who understood what really mattered in life. Her eyes never once moved in my direction. After dinner, I offered to help clean up, but Amanda waved me away. "Oh no, we've got it handled. The service will take care of everything." Service. Of course there was service. These people didn't wash their own dishes any more than they worried about mortgage payments or medical bills. I sat alone in their pristine living room, watching Daniel laugh with his new family, and realized that somewhere along the way, I'd been edited out of his story. Not dramatically, not with cruel words or obvious rejection, but gradually, politely, systematically. I'd become the embarrassing prologue to his real life, the rough draft he'd rather people didn't read. The drive home was the longest 40 minutes of my life. I kept replaying moments from the dinner, searching for signs that I was wrong, that my son still valued the woman who'd raised him. But every memory just confirmed what I already knew. I'd become a stranger in my own child's life, tolerated but not treasured, included but not embraced. That night, I sat in my small apartment and wondered when exactly I'd lost him. Was it gradual, or had there been a moment, a conversation, a realization, when he'd decided his mother was no longer good enough for the life he wanted to live? I was about to find out just how thoroughly he'd already written me off. I started trying harder after that Easter dinner, convinced that if I could just find the right approach, the right words, I could bridge the growing gap between us. Maybe I'd been too passive, too understanding. Maybe Daniel needed to see that I could fit into his new world, that I wasn't the embarrassment he seemed to think I was. I enrolled in a computer class at the community center, thinking if I could learn to email and use social media properly, we could stay in better touch. At 68, I was the oldest student by decades, fumbling with keyboards while 20-somethings helped me understand concepts that seemed as foreign as rocket science. But I persisted, driven by the hope that technology might be the bridge back to my son's life. My first email to Daniel was carefully crafted, spell-checked 3 times. I told him about the class, about learning new things, about a funny story from work. I hit send with the excitement of a teenager sending her first love letter, then checked my inbox obsessively for days waiting for his response. When it finally came, it was 2 lines. "That's great, Mom. Glad you're staying busy. Talk soon." No questions about the class, no interest in the stories I'd shared, no warmth at all. Just polite acknowledgement, like I was an acquaintance updating him on mundane details of a life he had no real interest in. But I kept trying. I sent him articles I thought he'd find interesting, photos of his childhood that I'd finally learned to scan and attach. Most went unanswered. When he did respond, it was always brief, distracted, like he was checking items off a duty list rather than communicating with someone who loved him. The breaking point came when I decided to surprise him at his office for his birthday. I'd always made him a cake, chocolate with peanut butter frosting, his favorite since he was 7 years old. I spent hours getting it perfect, then took 3 buses across town to reach his downtown building, carrying the cake box like precious cargo. The law firm's lobby was all marble and glass, intimidating in its expensive elegance. The receptionist looked at me like I was lost, taking in my modest clothes and homemade cake with barely concealed confusion. "I'm here to see Daniel Morrison," I said, trying to sound confident. "I'm his mother." Her expression shifted to something that might have been pity. "Oh, let me call his office." She spoke in hushed tones, her hand partially covering the phone, like she was discussing something embarrassing that needed to be handled delicately. Daniel appeared 5 minutes later, his face cycling through surprise, panic, and something that looked like mortification. He wasn't alone. Amanda was with him, probably having lunch together. Both of them dressed in that effortless, expensive way that made my department store outfit feel like a costume. "Mom? How did you—" He looked around the lobby nervously, as if checking to see who might be witnessing this unexpected appearance of his background. "I brought you a birthday cake," I said, holding up the box with pride that was rapidly curdling into shame. "Your favorite. I thought maybe we could celebrate. Just for a few minutes." Amanda's laugh was soft, but sharp. "Oh, that's so sweet. But Daniel's actually trying to cut back on sugar. We both are. Doctor's orders." She placed a possessive hand on his arm. "Plus, we have that lunch meeting with the Hendersons in 10 minutes. "The Hendersons?" I asked, though I already knew these were more of Amanda's family connections, more opportunities that came through her rather than anything Daniel had earned himself. "Amanda's family friends," Daniel said, not meeting my eyes. "Important clients. We really can't be late." I stood there holding my cake, understanding with crushing clarity that I had become an inconvenience. Not just unwelcome, but actively problematic. Something that needed to be managed quickly before it complicated his carefully constructed professional image. "Of course," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "I should have called first." "Next time," Daniel said, but his tone suggested there shouldn't be a next time, that spontaneous visits from his working-class mother weren't appropriate for his new life. I rode the 3 buses home with my rejected cake, watching the city pass by through windows that seemed to reflect nothing but my own foolishness. At home, I sat at my kitchen table and ate a piece of the cake alone, tasting all the love I'd put into it, and wondering why that love had become something my own son was ashamed to accept in public. The humiliation deepened when I discovered, weeks later, that Daniel had celebrated his birthday, after all, at an upscale restaurant with Amanda's family and friends. I saw the photos on Amanda's social media. Daniel blowing out candles on a professionally decorated cake that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Everyone was dressed elegantly, laughing, toasting his success. I wasn't mentioned, wasn't missed, wasn't even thought of. They'd simply celebrated without me, as if I'd never existed. I tried calling to ask about it, to understand why I hadn't been included, but Daniel's explanation was worse than silence would have been. "It was just a small thing, Mom. Last minute. We didn't want to drag you all the way downtown again." Drag me. Like spending time with his mother was a burden, an obligation that required him to inconvenience himself for my sake. The final insult came when Amanda got promoted at her marketing firm. Daniel called me with the news, more animated than he'd been in months. "She's making partner at 28. Can you believe it?" I congratulated them both, genuinely happy that good things were happening in their lives. Maybe we could all celebrate together, I suggested. I could make dinner or we could go somewhere nice. My treat. The pause that followed lasted an eternity. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice carried that carefully patient tone people use with children who don't understand complicated adult situations. Mom, I appreciate the offer, but Amanda's parents are throwing a party. At the country club. It's kind of a formal thing. Business associates, family friends, you know how it is. But I didn't know how it was. I knew about celebrating achievements with the people who loved you. About including family in your joy, regardless of their bank account or social status. I knew about being proud of where you came from instead of pretending it didn't exist. Of course, I said, swallowing the hurt. Tell her congratulations from me. I will, Daniel said, but I knew he wouldn't. My congratulations wouldn't mean anything to Amanda, coming from someone she'd never considered worth knowing. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment and tried to remember the last time Daniel had seemed genuinely happy to hear from me. The last time he'd asked about my life, my health, my feelings. The last time he'd acted like I mattered to him beyond being an obligation to manage. I couldn't remember. That night, I pulled out photo albums I hadn't looked at in years, flipping through pictures of Daniel at every age, gap-toothed and grinning, graduating high school, starting college. In every photo, I could see the love between us, the bond that had seemed unbreakable. He'd been my whole world, and I'd thought I was at least a significant part of his. Now I was learning that love, even mother's love, even the deepest sacrifice and devotion, could be discarded when it became inconvenient. I was discovering that the child you pour your life into can grow up to see your love as a burden, your presence as an embarrassment, your very existence as something to be managed rather than cherished. I closed the photo albums and put them away, understanding finally that the son I'd raised was gone. The man who bore his name and face had decided that his mother was no longer worthy of his time, his respect, or his love. But I didn't know yet just how thoroughly he'd written me off. I didn't know that while I was grieving the loss of our relationship, he was already planning to take the one thing I had left, my financial security, my hope for the future, the savings that represented 43 years of backbreaking work. I was about to learn that even my money wasn't safe from his sense of entitlement. The silence between us stretched into months. I stopped calling first, stopped sending emails that went unanswered, stopped trying to insert myself into a life that clearly had no room for me. At night, I would sit by my phone, willing it to ring, imagining Daniel's voice saying he missed me, that he'd made a mistake, that he wanted his mother back in his life, but the phone stayed silent. I began to understand what it meant to grieve someone who was still alive. Daniel existed, was thriving even, but the son I'd raised, the boy who used to curl up next to me during movies, who'd bring me dandelions from the yard like they were roses, who'd once told me I was his best friend in the whole world, that child was gone as surely as if he'd died. My co-workers at the hospital started noticing the change in me. "You seem distant lately, Eva," my supervisor mentioned during one of our monthly check-ins. "Everything okay at home?" How could I explain that home felt like a museum of memories that no longer mattered to anyone but me? How could I say that I'd spent 43 years building a life around loving someone who now found that love embarrassing? "Just tired," I said, which was true. I was exhausted from caring so much about someone who cared so little about me. The worst part was how small my world had become. For decades, Daniel had been the center of everything. My motivation for working extra shifts, my reason for saving money, my source of pride and purpose. Now, with him gone from my daily thoughts by choice rather than distance, I had to confront how little else I'd built for myself. I'd been so focused on being his mother that I'd forgotten to be Eva. My apartment felt enormous and empty, even though it was barely 600 square feet. The silence was deafening. No phone calls to anticipate, no visits to prepare for, no future plans that included anyone but myself. I'd go entire weekends without speaking to another human being, The sound of my own voice becoming foreign when I finally used it to order groceries or talk to cashiers. I started leaving the television on just for background noise, anything to fill the quiet that pressed against my eardrums like water. Game shows, news programs, old movies. It didn't matter what was playing as long as it created the illusion that life was happening somewhere, even if it wasn't happening to me. The photo of Daniel on my nightstand began to feel like a taunt. Every night, I'd look at his 5-year-old face beaming back at me and wonder where I'd gone wrong. Had I loved him too much? Not enough? Had I spoiled him or failed to prepare him for the world? The questions circled endlessly, offering no answers, only more reasons to blame myself for losing the most important relationship in my life. I considered taking the photo down, packing away all the reminders of what we used to be, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Those pictures were proof that I'd once mattered to someone, that my love had once been treasured instead of discarded. Without them, what evidence would I have that my life had meant anything at all? Work became my only anchor to reality, the only place where I still felt useful. But even there, I found myself going through the motions rather than truly engaging. Patients would thank me for my care, and I'd smile and nod. But the warmth that had once made me good at my job felt hollow now. How could I comfort others when I couldn't heal the wound in my own heart? One particularly difficult night, after losing a patient I'd grown fond of, an elderly man whose children visited daily, who was surrounded by love even in his final moments, I broke down in the supply closet. I cried for him, for the family he was leaving behind, but mostly I cried for myself, for the realization that I might die as alone as I was living. That's when I made the decision that would change everything, though I didn't know it at the time. Sitting on the floor of that supply closet, surrounded by medical equipment and feeling utterly defeated, I decided to write Daniel a letter. Not an email that could be easily deleted, not a phone call he could cut short, but a real letter that would require him to hold something I'd touched, to see my handwriting, to confront my words with his own hands. I spent 3 weeks writing that letter, drafting and redrafting until every word was exactly what I needed to say. I told him about the sacrifices I'd made that he'd never known about, the times I'd gone without medication so he could have new school clothes, the job opportunities I'd turned down because they would have required moving him away from his friends, the relationships I'd never pursued because I didn't want any man to ever make him feel like he wasn't my priority. I told him about the pride I'd carried for him, how I'd bragged about his achievements to anyone who would listen, how I'd kept every report card and award and newspaper clipping that mentioned his name. I explained how it felt to watch him build a life that had no space for the woman who'd made it possible, how it hurt to be treated like an embarrassment, rather than a treasure. But mostly, I told him I loved him, that I would always love him, no matter how much distance he put between us, no matter how completely he erased me from his story. I told him that loving him had been the greatest privilege of my life, even if that love was no longer welcome. I sealed the letter in an envelope with his name written in my best handwriting, the way I used to address his birthday cards when he was small. I put a stamp on it and carried it to the mailbox on the corner, holding it for a long moment before letting it drop through the slot. Then I waited. Days passed, then weeks. No response came. No phone call, no return letter, no acknowledgement that he'd even received it. The silence that followed was different from what had come before. It was deliberate, final, a door slamming shut on any possibility of reconciliation. That's when I truly gave up. Not dramatically, not with anger or tears, but with a quiet resignation that settled into my bones like cold weather. I stopped checking my phone obsessively, stopped jumping every time it rang hoping it might be him. I accepted that I'd raised a son who could read his mother's heart poured out on paper and feel nothing, do nothing, say nothing in return. I began to plan for a future that included only myself. I calculated how long my savings would last if I was careful, how many years I could work before my body gave out, what kind of end-of-life care I could afford as a woman with no family to advocate for her. The numbers were depressing but manageable if I was smart about it. That's when I made the practical decision that would prove to be the biggest mistake of my life. I thought about the bank account I'd been building for 43 years, every dollar earned through double shifts and sacrifice. I had over $100,000, not a fortune, but enough to ensure I wouldn't be a burden to anyone, enough to maintain my dignity even if I had to stop working. I decided that if Daniel ever did face a real crisis, if he ever truly needed help, I wanted to be able to provide it. So I added him to my bank account as a secondary holder, thinking that if something happened to me, if I had a heart attack or stroke, he'd be able to handle my affairs without the complications of probate court. It seemed like such a reasonable precaution, the kind of practical planning responsible adults do for their families. I even told myself it was a gesture of faith, proof that despite everything, I still trusted him, still wanted to take care of him even if he no longer wanted to take care of me. I had no idea I was handing him the key to destroy what little security I had left. At the bank, the representative congratulated me on being so forward-thinking. "It's smart to have someone you trust with access to your accounts," she said as I signed the paperwork. "Especially family. There's nothing more important than family." I smiled and nodded, believing her completely. I believed that no matter how distant Daniel had become, no matter how completely he'd written me out of his life, he would never deliberately hurt me. I believed that the boy I'd raised still existed somewhere inside the man he'd become. I was about to learn just how wrong I could be. But in that moment, signing those papers with my careful handwriting, I still had something they'd overlooked. I had 43 years of survival instincts, decades of making something from nothing, a lifetime of being underestimated by people who thought they knew what I was capable of. They had no idea what they'd just awakened. The bank statement arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, mixed in with the usual collection of bills and advertisements that filled my mailbox. I almost didn't open it right away. I'd been checking my balance obsessively online since adding Daniel to the account, partly from habit, and partly from the strange comfort of seeing those numbers that represented security, independence, the fruits of a lifetime of careful saving. But something made me tear open the envelope that morning. Maybe the thickness of it, the weight that suggested more pages than usual. What I found inside made my coffee cup slip from my hands, ceramic shattering against the kitchen floor, as my world imploded for the second time in 6 months. Account balance, $247.32. I stared at the number, certain there had been some mistake. Just 3 weeks ago, when I'd last checked online, the balance had been $103,147.15. I'd known it by heart, the way some people know their phone numbers or addresses. That money represented 43 years of choosing generic brands over name brands, walking to work instead of taking buses when the weather was decent, wearing shoes until they couldn't be repaired anymore. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, looking for an explanation, some logical reason why over $100,000 had vanished. What I found was worse than a bank error. What I found was a systematic dismantling of my life's work, transaction by transaction, each one authorized with Daniel's access to the account I'd trusted him with. September 15th, $12,000 withdrawal. Memo. Honeymoon expenses. September 18th, $8,500 withdrawal. Memo. Wedding rings upgrade. September 22nd, $15,000 withdrawal. Memo. Amanda's wardrobe. September 28th, $25,000 withdrawal. Memo. Car down payment. The list continued for pages. Spa treatments, designer handbags, expensive dinners, a luxury weekend getaway. Each transaction felt like a physical blow, proof that while I'd been grieving the loss of our relationship, Daniel had been systematically looting the account I'd foolishly given him access to. But it was the final entry that broke something fundamental inside me. October 1st, $38,000 withdrawal. Memo. Investment opportunity. Amanda's father's advice. They'd gambled with the largest portion of my savings on some business venture suggested by Amanda's father, treating my life's work like play money, like an unlimited credit card attached to someone else's account. The casual entitlement of it was breathtaking. They'd spent my retirement fund on their honeymoon, their luxury lifestyle, their investment dreams, without apparently giving a single thought to the woman who'd earned every dollar. I called the bank immediately, my voice shaking as I explained that there had to be some mistake, that I hadn't authorized these withdrawals, that someone had stolen my money. The customer service representative was polite but firm. All withdrawals had been made by the authorized account holder, using proper identification and security codes. Everything was legal, documented, irreversible. Ma'am, when you added your son to the account, you gave him full access to all funds. These transactions are completely legitimate according to our records. Legitimate, legal, authorized. The words felt like weapons, each one designed to explain why the system that was supposed to protect me had instead facilitated my destruction. I'd signed the papers myself, walked into the bank voluntarily, made the decision that had enabled my own financial ruin. I hung up and sat in my kitchen surrounded by the broken pieces of my coffee cup, understanding with crystal clarity that I'd been played. While I was writing heartfelt letters about love and sacrifice, Daniel was calculating how to convert my devotion into cash. While I was grieving the loss of our relationship, he was already planning how to liquidate the evidence of my life's work. The phone rang 20 minutes later. Daniel's name appeared on the caller ID, and for one insane moment, my heart leaped with hope. Maybe he was calling to explain, to apologize, to tell me there had been some terrible misunderstanding. "Hi, Mom." His voice was casual, almost cheerful. "Just wanted to give you a heads up. Amanda and I used some money from the account for the honeymoon and some other things. Hope that's okay." Some money, some other things. Like he'd borrowed $20 for gas instead of stealing my entire life savings. "Daniel," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "you took over $100,000. Well, yeah, but you weren't really using it, right? I mean, you live pretty simply, and Amanda's dad thinks we can double it with this investment opportunity. We'll pay you back with interest." The casual dismissal of my simple lifestyle, the assumption that because I lived modestly, I didn't need or deserve financial security, the promise of repayment that sounded as sincere as a campaign pledge, it all crystallized into a moment of perfect understanding. My son didn't see me as a person with rights, needs, or dignity. He saw me as a resource to be exploited, a bank account with sentimental attachments that could be safely ignored as long as he maintained the pretense of eventual repayment. "When?" I asked. "When what? When will you pay me back?" There was a pause, and I could almost hear him calculating, trying to determine what timeline would sound reasonable to the woman he'd just robbed. "Soon, Mom. Maybe 6 months, a year at most. Amanda's dad is really connected, knows all the right people. This is basically a sure thing. A sure thing." My retirement security had been gambled on a sure thing by people who'd never worked a day in a factory, never chosen between medication and groceries, never stayed awake at night calculating whether they could afford both rent and utilities in the same month. "And if it doesn't work out?" I asked. Another pause, longer this time. "It will work out. But listen, I have to run. Amanda and I are meeting with the investors. I'll call you later, okay?" He hung up before I could respond, leaving me alone with the devastation of my financial security and the knowledge that my son had become someone I no longer recognized. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the bank statements spread before me like evidence in a trial, trying to understand how I'd raised a person capable of such casual cruelty. I thought about every sacrifice I'd made, every choice I'd prioritized his needs over my own, every moment I'd taught him right from wrong through example rather than lecture. Where had I gone wrong? Had I been too generous? Too selfless? Had I failed to teach him the value of money because I'd always made sure he had what he needed? Had my love somehow created this sense of entitlement that allowed him to see my savings as his inheritance to claim whenever convenient? But, as the hours passed, something shifted inside me. The shock faded, replaced by something harder, clearer, more focused. I began to see my situation not as a victim, but as someone who'd been underestimated by people who thought they knew what I was capable of. They'd taken my money, but they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd assumed I was helpless. They'd counted on my silence, my unwillingness to make a scene, my maternal instinct to protect Daniel even when he was destroying me. They'd gambled that the woman who'd spent 43 years quietly enduring and sacrificing would continue to quietly endure and sacrifice even when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. They had no idea that quiet didn't mean weak. They didn't understand that patient didn't mean powerless. They'd confused my love for my son with an inability to fight back when that love was weaponized against me. I pulled out a notebook and began making lists. Phone numbers I needed to call, information I needed to gather, steps I needed to take. My handwriting was steady, methodical, the penmanship of someone who'd spent decades filling out medical charts under pressure, someone who'd learned to stay calm in crisis situations. For 43 years, I'd been a nurse. I'd dealt with emergencies, made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death, managed chaos with competence and grace. I'd talked hysterical family members through impossible situations, coordinated complex care plans, advocated for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. Daniel and Amanda had apparently forgotten that quiet competence was different from weakness. They'd mistaken my maternal devotion for gullibility, my working-class background for stupidity, my age for helplessness. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. As I closed the notebook and prepared for bed, I realized something had fundamentally changed inside me during those hours of planning. The grief was still there, the hurt still ached, but underneath it all was something new, a cold, clear determination that felt like steel forming in my bones. This wasn't pain anymore. This was decision, and I had 43 years of survival instincts they'd never even imagined. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that grew cold while I worked, filling pages of my notebook with careful observations, phone numbers, and plans. By dawn, I had mapped out exactly what Daniel and Amanda had done, when they'd done it, and most importantly, what I was going to do about it. The first step was research. I called in sick to work, the first time I'd done so in over 3 years, and spent the day at the public library, using their computers to learn everything I could about financial fraud, elder abuse laws, and the legal rights of victims. What I discovered both encouraged and infuriated me. Technically, what Daniel had done wasn't illegal since I'd given him access to the account, but morally, ethically, it was theft of the most personal kind. And there were options available to me that my son had apparently never considered, probably because he'd never imagined his quiet, compliant mother would fight back. I printed out forms, researched lawyers who specialized in elder financial abuse, and learned about civil remedies that could force restitution even when criminal charges weren't possible. I discovered that courts took a dim view of adult children who exploited their parents' trust, especially when those parents were elderly and the exploitation was systematic. But most importantly, I learned that I wasn't powerless. The system that had enabled my victimization also provided ways to seek justice, if I was brave enough to use them. Over the following weeks, I became a student of my own situation. I documented everything, copied bank records, saved every text message and voicemail from Daniel, printed out social media posts where Amanda bragged about their expensive purchases. I was building a case, creating a paper trail that would tell the story of how 2 privileged young adults had systematically robbed an elderly nurse of her life savings. Meanwhile, Daniel and Amanda seemed to believe their theft had gone unnoticed, or at least unchallenged. Amanda's Instagram continued to showcase their upgraded lifestyle, photos of designer handbags that cost more than my monthly rent, restaurant meals that represented weeks of my grocery budget, spa treatments that were casual indulgences in their world, but would have been impossible luxuries in mine. The casual cruelty of flaunting their stolen prosperity made my resolve stronger. They weren't just thieves. They were thieves who felt entitled to humiliate their victim by showing off their crimes publicly. Daniel called twice during this period, both times with the same casual tone he'd used when first admitting to the theft. The first call came 3 weeks after my discovery, probably when he realized I hadn't responded to his previous dismissive explanation. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. How are you doing?" His voice carried that forced cheerfulness people use when they're trying to gauge whether they're in trouble. "I'm fine, Daniel," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in months. "How's the investment going? The one you used my retirement money for?" There was a pause. Well, these things take time, but Amanda's dad is really optimistic. He knows what he's doing. I'm sure he does. How much have you lost so far?" Another pause, longer this time. "We haven't lost anything, Mom. It's just, the market's been volatile lately, But we're looking at long-term gains here. Translation: they'd already lost a significant portion of my money, and Amanda's father's sure thing was proving to be exactly what I'd expected. A risky gamble by people who could afford to lose other people's money. I see, I said. Well, I hope it works out for you. Something in my tone must have worried him because his voice became slightly defensive. It will work out, and like I said, we'll pay you back with interest. You don't need to worry about anything. Don't worry. After working 43 years to build financial security, after having my entire life savings stolen by my own son, I shouldn't worry. The audacity was breathtaking. Of course, I said. Take care, Daniel. The second call came a month later, and this time Daniel sounded genuinely concerned. Mom, I tried calling you at work and they said you'd been out sick. Are you okay? Do you need anything? The irony of him asking if I needed anything after stealing everything I had would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. But I'd learned to control my emotions by then, to channel my anger into something more useful than tears. I'm fine, I said. Just needed some time to think about things, to make some decisions about my future. What kind of decisions? There was wariness in his voice now, the first hint that he might be beginning to understand that his actions had consequences beyond his immediate benefit. Oh, just practical things. Financial planning, legal matters. You know how it is when you get older. You have to start thinking about protecting yourself. I could almost hear him trying to interpret my words, searching for hidden threats or accusations. But I'd given him nothing concrete to worry about, just the vague suggestion that his elderly mother was taking steps to secure her future. That's good, I guess. Being prepared is important. He paused. Is there anything I can help you with? Any questions about finances or legal stuff? The offer to help with legal matters after committing what amounted to legal theft was so absurd that I almost laughed. No, thank you. I'm handling everything myself. I'm more capable than people assume. After I hung up, I realized that Daniel was beginning to sense something had changed, but he couldn't identify what or how much. He was starting to worry, but he didn't yet understand that his worry was justified. During this time, I also began reaching out to people I'd lost touch with over the years. Old colleagues from the hospital, neighbors I'd known but rarely spoke to, even distant relatives who'd grown up with Daniel and remembered him as a child. I wasn't gossiping or complaining. I was simply reconnecting, rebuilding relationships I'd let fade while I was focused entirely on being Daniel's mother. What I discovered was both heartbreaking and empowering. Many of these people had noticed Daniel's treatment of me long before I'd been willing to acknowledge it. They'd seen how he dismissed me at social gatherings, how he avoided including me in his life, how he seemed embarrassed by the woman who'd raised him. I always wondered about that boy, said Martha, a former co-worker who'd retired 5 years earlier. Even when he was young, visiting you at the hospital, he always seemed entitled, like the world owed him something just for existing. Others shared similar observations. They'd watched Daniel take my sacrifices for granted, seen him treat my devotion as his due rather than a gift. They'd noticed things I'd been too close to see, patterns of behavior that had been building for years. But they also reminded me of who I was beyond being Daniel's mother. They remembered the nurse who'd worked double shifts to cover for sick colleagues, the woman who'd organized charity drives for families in crisis, the person who'd never hesitated to help when someone needed support. You were always the strongest person in any room, Martha continued, even when you didn't realize it, even when other people underestimated you. These conversations helped me understand that my strength hadn't disappeared. I'd simply forgotten it existed. For so many years, I'd defined myself entirely in relation to Daniel, measuring my worth by his success and approval. But I'd had an identity before he was born, skills and capabilities that had nothing to do with being his mother. I began making other preparations as well. I opened a new bank account at a different institution, one where Daniel had no access and no knowledge. I moved my remaining $247.32 there, along with my paychecks as I returned to work. It wasn't much, but it was mine, secure from any future theft. I also consulted with an attorney, a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in elder abuse cases. She listened to my story with the kind of focused attention that told me she'd heard similar tales before. "What they did is morally reprehensible," she said, after reviewing the documents I'd assembled. "And while it may not be technically criminal, there are civil remedies available. We can file suit for restitution, and given the systematic nature of the theft and your son's apparent lack of remorse, I think we have a strong case." "What would that involve?" I asked. "Full financial disclosure from both of them. Asset seizure if necessary to recover your money. Public court proceedings where their behavior would be examined and judged. It wouldn't be quick or easy, but it would send a clear message that stealing from elderly parents has serious consequences." I thanked her and told her I'd be in touch. I wasn't ready to file suit yet. I had something else in mind first. Something that would give Daniel and Amanda a chance to do the right thing before I escalated to legal action. But as I walked out of that lawyer's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not hope that Daniel would spontaneously develop a conscience, but hope that I could reclaim my dignity and security through my own actions. That evening, I sat in my quiet apartment and began writing another letter. Not to Daniel this time, but to myself. A letter I would read whenever I started to doubt my resolve, whenever the maternal instinct to protect him threatened to override my instinct for self-preservation. In that letter, I reminded myself that love shouldn't require self-destruction, that being a good mother didn't mean accepting abuse from an ungrateful child, that I deserved better than to spend my final years in poverty because I'd trusted the wrong person with my security. As I sealed that letter and put it in my dresser drawer, I realized that the scared, devastated woman who'd discovered the theft was gone. In her place was someone harder, wiser, more determined. Daniel and Amanda had awakened something they couldn't control, and they had no idea what was coming for them. The call came on a Thursday morning in December, 6 months after I'd discovered the theft. Daniel's voice was different this time, shaky, desperate, stripped of the casual confidence that had characterized all our previous conversations since his marriage. "Mom, I really need to talk to you. Can I come over? Like, right now?" I'd been expecting this call for weeks. Amanda's social media posts had stopped abruptly 3 weeks earlier. No more designer handbag photos, no more expensive restaurant check-ins, no more spa day celebrations. The silence was telling, and I'd correctly guessed what it meant. "Of course," I said, my voice calm and measured. "I'll put coffee on." He arrived 40 minutes later, looking like he'd aged years in the months since I'd last seen him. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his face carrying the kind of stress that comes from watching your world collapse in real time. Amanda wasn't with him. That told me everything I needed to know. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice small and uncertain. He looked around my modest apartment like he was seeing it for the first time, taking in the simple furniture, the secondhand decorations, the life I'd built with what little remained after his theft. "Hello, Daniel. You look tired. Sit down." He perched on the edge of my old couch, the one I'd bought at a thrift store 15 years ago and kept because it was comfortable, not because it was stylish. His hands were shaking slightly, whether from caffeine, stress, or something stronger, I couldn't tell. "How are you doing?" he asked, and for the first time in months, the question seemed genuine rather than perfunctory. "I'm well," I said, settling into my rocking chair with my coffee. "Better than I expected to be, actually. How are you?" He looked down at his hands, and I saw something I hadn't seen since he was a child caught in a lie. Shame. "Not good, Mom. Not good at all." He took a shaky breath. "Amanda left me." I waited. I'd learned the power of silence over the past few months, the way it could make other people fill the space with truths they'd rather keep hidden. "She took everything," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "The car, the jewelry, even the furniture from the apartment. Her family got me fired from the firm, said I was a liability to their reputation. Apparently, when the investment went bad, they decided I was the problem." "The investment?" I asked, though I already knew what he was going to tell me. "We lost it all, Mom. Every penny. Amanda's father's sure thing was some kind of Ponzi scheme. The SEC shut it down, arrested half the people involved. Amanda's dad is probably going to prison." He looked up at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and desperate. "I don't have anything left. No job, no money, no place to live. Amanda won't even take my calls. I sipped my coffee and studied my son's face. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. The consequences I'd known would eventually arrive. But seeing him broken like this didn't bring the satisfaction I'd expected. Instead, it brought clarity. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Not sorry that justice had finally caught up with him, but sorry that it had taken losing everything for him to remember he had a mother. I was wondering. He paused, swallowed hard, tried again. "I was hoping maybe I could stay here for a while, just until I get back on my feet. I know I don't deserve it, but I don't have anywhere else to go." There it was. The moment of truth, the test that would determine what kind of person my son really was underneath the entitlement and selfishness. Would he acknowledge what he'd done? Would he apologize? Would he show any recognition of the pain he'd caused? "That's quite a request," I said carefully, considering our recent history. He looked confused, as if he genuinely didn't understand what I was referring to. "What do you mean?" My heart sank, but I wasn't surprised. Even facing his own destruction, even desperate for my help, he still couldn't acknowledge what he'd done to me. "The money, Daniel. My life savings that you took without permission. The $100,000 you and Amanda spent on your lifestyle while I figured out how to survive on what was left." His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, defensiveness, and finally something that might have been the beginning of awareness. "But I told you we'd pay you back," he said weakly. "This was just temporary. A setback." "With what?" I asked, my voice still calm. "You just told me you have nothing left. No job, no money, no assets. How exactly were you planning to repay me?" For the first time, he seemed to truly grasp the magnitude of what he'd done. The color drained from his face as he realized that his promises of repayment had been built on nothing but arrogance and privilege, that he'd gambled away his mother's security based on connections that had evaporated the moment things went wrong. I thought. He stopped, started again. "I never meant for this to happen." "What did you think would happen, Daniel? When you took money that didn't belong to you, money I'd saved for 43 years and gave it to people to gamble with? What outcome did you imagine?" He was crying now, real tears that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than self-pity. "I thought we'd make more money. I thought I'd be able to pay you back twice what we borrowed. Amanda's family, they made it sound so easy, so guaranteed. It wasn't yours to risk," I said quietly. "It was never yours to take." "I know," he whispered. "I know that now. But at the time, it felt like you weren't using it anyway. Like it was just sitting there. Just sitting there. My life's work, my security, my hope for independence in old age. It was just sitting there, apparently serving no purpose until he decided to put it to better use." "Do you have any idea what you've put me through?" I asked. "Do you understand what it's like to discover that your own child sees you as nothing more than a bank account to raid when convenient?" He looked up at me with something that might have been the beginning of genuine remorse. "I never thought of it that way. I was so focused on the opportunity, on building something bigger. I thought you'd understand." "I understood perfectly," I said. I understood that the son I raised had decided his mother's welfare was less important than his wife's shopping habits. I understood that 43 years of sacrifice meant nothing compared to impressing people who would abandon you the moment you became inconvenient. The truth of that last statement hit him like a physical blow. Amanda and her family had indeed abandoned him completely, cutting him off the moment his usefulness ended. "What do I do now?" he asked. And for the first time since childhood, he sounded like he was genuinely asking for my guidance rather than just expecting my resources. I reached into the drawer of my side table and pulled out an envelope. Inside were copies of all the documents I'd assembled over the past months: bank records, legal research, the consultation notes from my attorney. I'd planned to give these to him eventually, but I'd imagined the conversation going differently. "This is what you're going to do," I said, handing him the envelope. "You're going to look at every document in here. You're going to see exactly what you took from me, penny by penny. You're going to understand the legal definition of elder financial abuse and the consequences that are available to victims." His hands shook as he opened the envelope and saw the contents: legal documents, financial records, contact information for attorneys specializing in elder abuse cases. Then, I continued, you're going to decide whether you want to make this right through restitution and genuine repentance, or whether you want to face the legal consequences of what you've done, because those are your only two options now. He looked up at me with something like fear. You'd actually sue me? Your own son? My own son stole my life savings, I replied calmly. My own son left me with $247 after 43 years of work. My own son gambled away my security based on advice from people who wouldn't even take his calls now. So yes, if that's what it takes to recover what you stole, I will absolutely pursue every legal remedy available to me. The silence that followed was different from any we'd shared before. Not the cold distance of recent months, not the awkward politeness of family obligations, but the profound quiet of someone finally understanding the magnitude of their actions. I'm sorry, he said finally, and for the first time it sounded real. I'm so sorry, Mom. I never thought about what it would mean for you. I know you didn't, I said. That's exactly the problem. He sat there for a long time, looking through the documents, seeing his crime laid out in black and white. When he finally looked up, something fundamental had changed in his expression. What would you need from me? He asked quietly. To make this right? It was the first question he'd asked in months that seemed focused on my needs rather than his own. What I needed from Daniel wasn't just money, though that was certainly part of it. What I needed was something that couldn't be calculated in dollars and cents. I needed my dignity back, my sense of worth restored, and most importantly, I needed to know that the lessons I'd tried to teach him about right and wrong had finally taken root. First, I said, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate care, you're going to sell everything you still own. The watch, the designer clothes, anything of value that came from my money. Every penny goes toward repaying what you stole. He nodded, though I could see him mentally calculating how little that would actually amount to. Most of what they'd bought had probably been sold already to fund their lifestyle after the investment collapsed. Second, you're going to get a job, any job that will hire you, and 50% of every paycheck goes to me until every dollar is repaid. Not approximately repaid, not mostly repaid. Every single dollar, with interest. That could take years, he said, not complaining but simply stating a fact. It took me 43 years to save that money, I replied. A few years to repay it seems reasonable. He nodded again, understanding perhaps for the first time the scope of what he'd destroyed. Third, I continued, you're going to write letters of apology to every person who witnessed your treatment of me over the past year. Your colleagues, Amanda's family, anyone who saw you dismiss me or treat me like an embarrassment. You're going to acknowledge publicly what you did and take full responsibility. This was harder for him than the financial restitution, I could see. Money could be earned back, but reputation and pride, once lost, were much more difficult to recover. And fourth, I said, saving the most important for last, you're going to move back here, into this apartment, for as long as it takes to make this right. Not because you need somewhere to stay, but because you need to remember what it means to be part of a family that takes care of each other instead of exploiting each other. He looked around the small apartment again, this time with different eyes. Not the embarrassed assessment of someone ashamed of his background, but perhaps the beginning of appreciation for the home his mother had built and maintained on a working person's salary. You'd let me stay here? After what I did? I'm not letting you do anything, I said firmly. I'm requiring it. If you want to avoid legal consequences, if you want any chance of rebuilding a relationship with me, you'll live here, and you'll contribute to this household, and you'll learn what it means to be grateful for what you have, instead of constantly reaching for what you think you deserve. Over the following months, Daniel kept his word. He found work, not the prestigious career he'd imagined, but honest employment at a local accounting firm that was willing to hire someone with his skills, despite his tarnished reputation. He came home every evening to our small apartment, handed over half his paycheck, and slowly began to understand what his mother's life had been like. He learned to cook simple meals, to comparison shop for groceries, to repair things instead of replacing them. He discovered that contentment could be found in modest circumstances, that happiness didn't require luxury, that dignity came from honest work rather than impressive titles. But most importantly, he learned to see me clearly for the first time in years, not as an embarrassment to be managed or a resource to be exploited, but as a person who'd built a good life through character and determination. The letters he wrote were painful for both of us, but necessary. He wrote to his former law partners, apologizing for his behavior and acknowledging that he'd disrespected the woman who'd made his education possible. He wrote to Amanda's parents, taking full responsibility for the financial disaster and absolving them of any obligation to consider his welfare in their family decisions. Each letter was a small reclamation of his integrity, a step toward becoming the man I'd always hoped he could be. The most difficult letter was the one he wrote to Amanda herself, not because he wanted her back. Those illusions had been thoroughly shattered, but because he needed to acknowledge how he'd allowed their relationship to damage his relationship with me. "I let you convince me that my mother was somehow beneath us," he wrote. "I allowed you to make me ashamed of the woman who sacrificed everything for my success. I chose your approval over her welfare, and I will regret that choice for the rest of my life." Amanda never responded to the letter, but that wasn't the point. The point was that Daniel had finally found the courage to speak truth, even when it served no practical purpose. The financial restitution took 3 years. 3 years of Daniel working steadily, living simply, and slowly rebuilding both his bank account and his character. I watched him discover satisfaction in honest work, watched him learn to find joy in small pleasures, watched him remember what it meant to be part of a family built on love rather than transaction. And gradually, something beautiful happened. We began to build a new relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than obligation. Daniel started asking about my day, my thoughts, my feelings. He began to see me as Eva the person, not just Mom the provider. He learned about my work at the hospital, the patients I'd cared for, the lives I'd touched over 4 decades of nursing. He discovered that his mother had skills, knowledge, and experiences that had nothing to do with serving his needs. He began to appreciate the woman I'd always been, underneath the role I'd played in his life. On the day he made the final payment, $103,147, 15 plus interest, transferred back into my newly secured account. We sat together in our small kitchen and shared a meal he'd cooked himself. It was simple food, nothing fancy, but it tasted like forgiveness and redemption. "I understand now," he said as we cleaned up together. "I understand what I almost threw away." "What's that?" I asked. "You," he said simply. "The most valuable thing in my life, and I almost lost it chasing things that never mattered." 6 months later, Daniel was offered a position with a firm that valued integrity over connections. The salary was modest compared to his previous job, but honest. He could have afforded his own apartment by then, but he chose to stay. "If it's okay with you," he said, "I'd like to keep living here. Not because I have to anymore, but because I want to. Because this feels like home in a way that expensive apartment never did." I agreed, of course. The apartment that had once felt too small for one person felt perfectly sized for 2 people who'd learned to appreciate each other's company. Daniel never remarried, though he dated occasionally. He brought the women he was serious about to meet me, not as an obligation, but because my opinion mattered to him. He wanted partners who could appreciate the kind of woman who'd raised him, who could see strength in simplicity and wisdom in experience. The money he'd repaid allowed me to retire comfortably when my body finally told me it was time to stop working nights and weekends. But by then, financial security felt less important than the security of knowing I'd raised a son who understood the difference between having money and having character. Sometimes in the evenings, we'd sit together on the couch he'd once been embarrassed by, watching television or reading, comfortable in each other's presence. He'd ask me to tell him stories about his childhood, about the struggles I'd hidden from him, about the woman I'd been before I became his mother. "I wish I'd known," he'd say. "I wish I'd understood what you were giving up for me." "You weren't supposed to know," I'd reply. "That's what love does. It protects people from seeing the cost of caring for them." Amanda eventually divorced him, of course, though by then it felt like a formality. She married someone else within a year, another lawyer, Another opportunity to climb social ladders that Daniel no longer cared about climbing. "Do you miss it?" I asked him once, after we'd seen an announcement of her engagement in the society pages. "The life you had with her?" He considered the question seriously before answering. "I miss who I thought I was," he said, "but I like who I actually am much better." That conversation happened on a quiet Sunday evening, 5 years after the day he'd called me desperate and broken. We were sitting in our kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd discovered his theft, where I'd planned my response, where I'd confronted him with the truth of what he'd done. But now it was just our kitchen again, the heart of a home built on honesty and mutual respect. As I tucked that memory away with all the others we'd built together, I realized something profound. I'd learned that sometimes silence speaks louder than words, that patient strength can be more powerful than angry confrontation, that love doesn't mean accepting abuse, even from those we love most. I'd discovered that dignity isn't something other people can take from you. It's something you choose to keep, no matter how difficult the circumstances become. And most importantly, I'd learned that it's never too late to teach someone the difference between being loved and being valued, between being needed and being respected. My son had spent years taking me for granted, but he spent the rest of his life making sure I knew how grateful he was for the second chance I'd given us both. Sometimes, when I see my reflection in the kitchen window during our evening conversations, I remember the broken woman who'd sat in this same spot holding a bank statement that showed $247.32s, feeling like her world had ended. That woman learned something valuable. The end of one world can be the beginning of a better one if you're brave enough to demand better for yourself. And sometimes, just sometimes, silence really does speak loudest of all.